I'm William Hurlbut. I'm a physician from Stanford University. I'm the chair of this session. Should be a very exciting session. Our title is Morality in the Social and Psychological Sciences. Before I begin, I've been asked to read a statement about general matters here. For guests who have registered for the meals, you can make your way to the South Dining Hall for lunch immediately following this session. There's a map in the front of your program, and student volunteers will be driving golf carts for anyone who might like their assistance. And Alistair McIntyre's presentation will begin promptly at 1:30 at the Morris Inn Ballroom, where we were last night, that is, okay? So, and before we begin, I just want to point out that it is Notre Dame's official policy to ask everybody in this room to wear a mask. As a physician, I feel it's my moral responsibility to tell you that it's very probable that there is one or more cases of COVID in this group of 1,000 people. And I would please ask you to take this matter seriously, especially because there are vulnerable people, vulnerable by age and comorbid conditions in this room, no doubt, at least in the whole of our conference. Please take this matter seriously. It really is a serious matter. This is a nasty illness. You don't want to get it. And you certainly don't want to transmit it. So having moralized a little, we'll go back to the grounds of moral behavior. I was at previous session I was at was on AI and trying to figure out what is the difference between machines and human beings, and how does our particular kind of dignity emerge from those differences. So we're going to explore this matter, most specifically the social and psychological dimensions of it, but we also have, as our first speaker, a physician philosopher, Jeffrey Bishop from the University of St. Louis University, actually. And so rather than read to you all these bios that you can read in the text, just let me briefly say Jeffrey is going to talk to us about the neuroscience of morality, scientific discovery, and social construction. Jeffrey is the director of the Albert Nagy?
Carnegie. I'm not the director anymore, but that's an old bio.
Okay, all right. Well, then I won't go on.
The director is sitting in the back.
Okay. After that, we're going to hear from Tarsha Narvaez on shifted baselines for human moral nature. And after that, Tarsha is a professor of psychology here at Notre Dame. And after that, we're going to hear from Mary Tarsha, who is a doctoral student here at Notre Dame. And her subject is entitled Humanity's Evolved Nest, the Neurobiological Building Blocks of Socio-Morality. So this is a very interesting, very important subject. We don't want to reduce ourselves down to categories that are either in machines or just have a kind of impersonal informational dimension. So we very much welcome these presentations. Thank you. Jeffrey.
I used to be the director, and finally I wised up and recruited a victim, my boss, victim back there at the back, of the Albert Carnegie Center for Healthcare Ethics at St. Louis University. I now am just a regular professor. So this is a part of a long project that I engaged in with two other thinkers, Therese Lysott and Andrew Michael. Therese is a moral theologian. Andrew is a practicing psychiatrist. And so we engaged on this project, and let me see, how do I advance slides here? Yes. We submit, just a little shameless self-promotion. We submitted the project as a project to the Expanded Reason Awards, and we fortunately, we won one of those. So this is the book project. This is the book that will come out. We submitted it as a project to the Expanded Reason Awards. It won the award, and now it's being published by Bloomsbury Academic. The book project explores the neuroscience, the way that neuroscience, how scientists imagine what morality is, okay? It's not so much that we often think we can discover it, like we can just be walking along and, oh, there's morality. It just shows up. Or we'd be scanning someone's brain and we say, aha, we found morality, okay? It doesn't quite work that way. And so I'm going to go through the process by which social scientists, behavioral scientists, psychologists go through this. And the thesis of the book is that the moral anthropology that animates the work of the neuroscience of morality stands in the lineage of Homo economicus. In other words, the model that they imagine moral behavior taking on is a model that looks more like economic behavior, okay? All right, so a few preliminaries. What is neuroscience? In the book, we make the case that neuroscience is actually a fusion of two separate sciences with different theories and models and methods and ways of thinking. Neurobiology on the one hand, and something we call the human sciences. Well, what are the human sciences? The human sciences, this is probably a paper unto itself as to how all of these different human sciences work together. But roughly speaking, there's the social and behavioral sciences. They can be anything from psychology to sociology to anthropology to behavioral science and even economics. Medicine, public health, those are also kinds of human sciences, okay? So today I'm focusing on two aspects of the construction of human science, okay? So it used to be the case that what we now call sciences were once the domain of philosophy, okay? Psychology was really a philosophy about the soul, okay? Psychology was really about philosophy about the soul. Political science was political philosophy. Sociology might have been political and moral philosophy together. And economics, which we now think of as a science, was really a subfield of moral philosophy, okay? So our task today is to ask the question, well, what is morality as the neuroscientists, these people who are trying to fuse together the neurobiology on the one hand and the social science or the behavioral science or the human science or psychology, fuse them together to find correlations between what the social science picks out and what the neurobiology picks out, say in an fMRI scan or in the genetic or in neurotransmitters or whatever. And there are multiple ways that this can be done. In order to understand this question, we're going to have to explore two questions. The first question is about the philosophy of social science. How does social science work, philosophically speaking? But then also the social philosophy of science. Science is primarily a social endeavor, I'm going to make the case, okay? Now, I'm influenced by a thinker who is a philosopher of science, a philosopher of medicine, and a philosopher of medical science named Ludwig Fleck. Fleck was a Polish Jew who was put into a concentration camps in the 1930s, but he was permitted to continue his scientific work. And so he survived Auschwitz, and he actually immigrated to Israel after this. He is a brilliant thinker. He's a precursor to Thomas Kuhn, and I think he's better than Kuhn, okay, in my estimation. And he says this, between the subject and the object, there exists a third thing, the community. It's creative, like the subject, refractory, like the object, and dangerous, like an elemental power. So there are three aspects of science. The subject, he says, the one who does the science, the object, that which the scientist is engaging or asking the question about, and then the community of scientists. They are those that create the questions asked by the scientists. That's the community. The questions emerge from the community of scientists, but also the questions about their objects, but also they assess the answers given, okay? So there is an important social dimension to the activity of even physics, right? Even physics, because you have to convince a community of scientists that what you've done is scientifically valid, okay? And that is an important part that we often forget. So as I move forward, there are two aspects to this presentation. The process of science, okay, the process of social science or the philosophy of social science, and also then the social philosophy of science. So I want to talk about the process. okay? And then I'm going to talk about the findings we gathered as we were engaging in our project in the neuroscience of morality, okay? All right, part one, the philosophy of social science, all right? So the objects studied by the social and human sciences, psychology, are really difficult to get your hands on. They're not like rocks. They're not like sitting there waiting for you to arrive at them, right? They are concepts like intelligence, or concepts like happiness or well-being, or morality, okay? Now, what is a psyche, okay? What is a social thing? How do we ask a question about that? What is a moral thing, okay? Those are difficult questions that social scientists philosophically have to begin to think about just to get their projects off the ground. So social and human sciences have a process by which their objects of inquiry get a little bit more solidified, okay? That process is called conceptual funneling, okay? Step one in this process is conceptualization. Define the concept. Define intelligence. Define morality, whatever it might be. Second is to operationalize that conceptual definition. And the way you operationalize a conceptual definition is you figure out what the operations are. And the operations are the way that you pick out a case of intelligence or a case of morality in reality, okay? So you kind of have to have, well, what are my criteria by which I'm going to say I have found this thing, intelligence, morality, whatever it is you're trying to study, well-being, okay? Those operations are called the operational definition. You have to operationalize the concept. Then you have to test the concept. You have to take the concept with its operations into the world, into reality, and try to say, haha, we found these people answered in this way. And it's really a complex way. It's very complex the way this happens. There's a lot of statistical maneuvering that is going on as we try to winnow a way to say, yes, yes, indeed, this operation, this identity criteria for the thing we're looking for actually is picking out the thing we think we're picking out, okay? That is an entire complex, statistically sophisticated process, okay? Then after you get lots of data, you start to compare that data. And once you start to do that, you start to wonder, well, did we get our concept right to begin with? And so you see, we come back around, starting with our concept, wherever that might emerge. That could emerge from philosophy. That could emerge from social science itself. It could emerge from folk literature. It can be gathered from doing large-scale surveys asking people, what is morality? Or what is intelligence, right? There are multiple ways we get that first concept, okay? Once we get the first concept, it goes through the process of operationalization, testing, and then the last step is to refine the original concept. Change it according to the very things that you've been doing, okay? Now, this is called conceptual funneling, but it can also be called an epistemological circuit, right? It starts to float above the things that you think you're looking for. And it comes like intelligence, for instance, but we would say, intelligence is an entity in the world. And we would test intelligent people, see what they scored, right? And then the test itself becomes the standard for what counts as intelligence in the world, okay? So this is a circular process, right, that happens. And so social scientists have to be very careful with this process because sometimes they wind up defining the thing they think they're looking for and then saying, aha, we found it. Okay. All right. So the human and social sciences are always having to ask themselves, to be critical of themselves about their own activities as scientists. How did we come to this, okay? All right, so our findings were, well, what is the concept that we want to look at when we think about morality? And so, well, the concept is vice, but what is vice, okay? Well, we have some standard ways that we talk about vice, and we have the entire history of psychiatry behind us to say, oh, it's antisocial behaviors. And we have diagnoses for antisocial personality disorder. We have tests to try, an inventory of tests to try to diagnose someone with antisocial personality disorder. And so we have the operational definition, which is antisocial personality disorder. but that too has its own history, okay? That concept of antisocial personality. All right, same thing with virtue. How do we define virtue? Well, we go through looking at the way that scientists are talking about virtue, and we find that really they're talking about pro-social attitudes and behaviors. And so virtue is reduced then to the operations that the tests for pro-social behaviors are trying to pick out. In addition to that, they always want to understand things in a context, okay? Now, this is just the social scientific side of this. We're not even talking about the neurobiology side of this, okay? So what is the community within which virtue or vice are manifesting themselves? And that winds up being socioeconomic status, okay? And looking at that, okay, in much of the literature, it is socioeconomic status. We're interested in, okay, what is the community? How is it forming people? How is it shaping antisocial personality? It's all of this kind of stuff, okay? And so we find that this literature sometimes reduces to that. And by the time we move to the popularizers of this literature, it becomes community is understood as socioeconomic status. Virtue is thought to be pro-social behavior. Vice is thought to be antisocial behavior. All right? All right. So in a way, especially once we get to the popularization level of this, neuroscience becomes, or the understanding of neuroscience becomes little more than imagining a human being as a utility maximizing animal. In other words, that's the definition of Homo economicus, okay? So we make that case in the book. So that's what we find in the book. Part 2, the social philosophy of social and human science, okay? Now we got to talk about, well, what is the social philosophy that is animating the work of the scientists themselves? Okay. So in other words, we're asking ourselves, from whence come the concepts? All right? So we always put things in terms of things that we already think we know, right? There's an old saying that I would have done much better in college if I had known that psychology was really biology, biology was really chemistry, chemistry was really physics, physics was really mathematics, mathematics was really logic, logic was really philosophy, and philosophy was really psychology. We wind up chasing our tail, trying to put what we think we know in terms of something we think we know better. Okay? That's what science attempts to do. All right. So where does this scientific knowledge reside? You thought about that. Where does this scientific knowledge reside? Is it between my ears as the scientist? Is it in the textbooks? Is it in the language? Where does it sit? Right? That's a fascinating question. Where does it sit? Is it in reality? That's metaphysics, right? Where does scientific knowledge sit? It's the community of scientists, right, who say what counts today as the best science. Where would you go to look for it in the community? It's a hard question, right? Those are questions we actually need to think about when we think we're discovering something about morality when we do an fMRI scan. When we take the psychological concept and try to map it onto the fMRI scan, or onto the neurotransmitters, or onto the genetic precursors that make the neurotransmitters, right? So we have to be careful about what it is that we think we're claiming and what it is that we think we're doing when we're doing neuroscience. Ludwig Fleck talks about 4 different kinds of science. The first he calls popular science. It's the science that kind of exists in the community. Now, that's a lot more sophisticated today than it was in the 1930s when Ludwig Fleck was writing. All right? So popular science is kind of like the generally accepted knowledge. We don't know necessarily as a general public what the fights are that the scientists themselves are having, right? So we don't know what they're arguing about, all right? But it's just kind of the generally accepted belief. Right now, in the world of neuroscience, we get a neuro everything, right? There are people out there talking about neuropolitics, neuroeconomics, neurohistory, neuro rights, okay? It's sort of like genetics was about 30 years ago. Genetics this, genetics that, right? We will find our true identity in the genome, Human Genome Project. We will find our true identity in the brain initiative, right? So we're always on the hunt for something that grounds us, okay? It exists in the popular level, okay? Then there's textbook science, a little bit more sophisticated. When we think of science, we mostly think we're talking about what's in a biology textbook. That's not science. That's probably more akin to philosophy, because it takes all of the scientific stuff and tries to synthesize it together. Hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of experiments that have been done, that have been winnowed down to a series of statements that we think we can link together across different kinds of scientific methodologies, as well as different things that we're looking at. It's a synthetic philosophical enterprise, textbook science is, okay? What is journal science? Journal science is the stuff that makes it into the journals, okay? That's a different kind of science. It's a very narrow question that emerges from that process that social scientist goes through, or that the neuroscientist goes through, okay? And then there's the vademecum science, which is the scientist's notebook, okay? The journal science, the textbook science doesn't talk about the fights that are going on. You know, they're talking about so-and-so's fighting this and saying this, and, you know, the scientific method was just synthesizing it as if it's non-complex at all, okay? But there are always fights going on, right? And those fights kind of make their way into that scientist's notebook, because that scientist now has, what is the community of scientists fighting about? Where does my little research fit in the midst of that conversation that is going on, okay? That's a different kind of science. But every one of these, at some level, has a community or a communal dimension, right? Every single one of them. So there is, in fact, a social philosophy of science that's there. And so the question is, well, what is the social philosophy of science that animates the social sciences and neuroscience, okay? Fleck talks about this as a communal process as well, okay? The communal process, he uses these terms. These terms are very relativistic and they're problematic. And I would use the different terms. He talks about an exoteric community, and the exoteric community is the community where everything seems to be blatantly obvious. It's sort of that popular level understanding, okay? Now there's an exoteric community of scientists as well, where all the scientists sort of know that this scientist is over here doing this aspect of science, and this other one is doing this other aspect. They have different methodologies. They're asking different kinds of questions, right? So there's a communal dimension even to that. There's an exoteric community. Then there's the esoteric community. The esoteric community are those who are very narrow. They're right down there at the nub of the questions. They might even be the scientists that are engaging in novel methodologies that nobody in science really understands at this point. That's sort of the leading edge, a handful of people that really know what's going on. And then that science eventually makes its way to the larger community, and it causes fights. The standard scientists say, no, we can't do this. That's bad science, right? Then people engaging in this novel one, the esoteric community, who really are the only ones that understand what's going on, that gradually emerges and it reaches a level or a status within the scientific community. And they're like, well, guess what? We can't dismiss that data anymore, okay? Because we've got confirmatory evidence that they were right, this esoteric community, the people we thought were outsiders, okay? So this is a process that is going on at every level. The level of the community of scientists, of people who are engaging in the same scientific questions and their methodologies, all the way up to the community level, all the way up to the level of popular science, okay? So, there is a social dimension to doing science of any kind. Ideas from popular science seep into textbooks as analogies sometimes, right? Kind of even folk tales will seep into textbooks as an attempt to try to explain what's going on. It happens in vademecum science as well, but it also happens in journal science at some level. This kind of seeping in of a larger communal understanding. In other words, there is always a popular imaginary, a social imaginary that unwittingly shapes the activities of science, okay? So, by social imaginary, I mean exactly what Charles Taylor means. It's an inchoate conception of the moral order of society that kind of animates it, and we just take it for granted, no questions asked. There's a kind of metaphysical moral ordering that we imagine is there that kind of operates in the background of all of our social institutions and sets the boundaries on what it's possible for the scientist, the next question for the scientist to ask. Okay? It even creates the conditions for the possibility of even imagining science at all. Okay? So, the neuroscience of morality emerges out of this larger social imaginary. The problem is, rarely do we attend to the social imaginary that animates science, okay? And so what we found when we went through this and looked at this development of science is that really what is animating behavior is that the human animal is imagined as the utility maximizing decision maker, a reasonable person, right? As Homo economicus meant it, okay? As it was first sort of defined. We argue that it mutates into Homo capitalis, freakonomics. The human is little more than a being that's caught in this web of the hidden side of everything. Okay? That's how it's imagined. Human one, is what I'm saying. So we found found that the rise of moral science as conceived in the 19th and 20th centuries is in very close concert with the rise of economic science. In fact, the rise of that the moral science intersects very carefully in the person of John Stuart Mill, who was probably one of the greatest positivist scientists there are out there. And he writes an essay that gets criticized. The term Homo economicus emerges from somebody criticizing him for saying, my God, he thinks the human is Homo economicus. And the next generation of people said, yes, it is Homo economicus. Okay? All right. Oh, two more slides. So the question is, we don't want neuroscience to become phrenological science. Okay? That would be a bad thing. And so what I'm trying to say in the neuroscience of morality is that is not a pipe. It's a representation of a pipe, culturally mediated through art. And on this side over here, that is not a brain. That is an fMRI of a brain, right? It's a picture of a brain. And it's certainly not morality, all right? I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey. That's kind of sobering, actually. Our next speaker is Tarsha Novaes.
Good afternoon. Let me find my PowerPoint here. Somewhere. All right. I'm going to talk without my mask, otherwise I stop breathing. I'm glad to see you all. We have a handout we'll give out before the discussion. And so please listen more than write notes because I'm going to go rather fast. There's a lot of information at evolvenest.org. We have a QR code at the end I'll show you, and Mary will too, for that, where we have blog posts, videos, podcasts, and all sorts of things. So for much of what I'm going to say, let's see if I can do it this way. All right. Well, we are unwell. United States, we have 2/3 of adults reporting adverse childhood experiences, and this is the outcomes from those, all sorts of negative health outcomes, mental and physical, adversity in childhood that's measured by ACEs, it's called, includes physical abuse, domestic violence, drug abuse in the family, and that kind of thing. 10 items. You can go take the 10 items yourself. The higher your score, the more likely you are to have an adverse outcome in adulthood. But we are unwell across the board, and this has been happening even before COVID. Our human well-being has been spreading, and the U.S. has some responsibility for this. In the United States, we've got incredible epidemics of depression, anxiety, suicidality, a shrinking lifespan. Folks under age 60 now are at a health disadvantage compared to other advanced nations. Child well-being ranks near the bottom, typically, in the last decades. And that's not all. Humans are doing poorly, but so is the planet. As you know, we've reached the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, according to E.O. Wilson. That means massive toxification of soil, air, water, massive species extinction, atmospheric degradation, global warming or climate instability, and also now we could add a 5th, pandemics. So we are not doing well. What happened? What did we forget? How can we be the only species, or some part of a species, destroying our habitat? Well, this is our answer. It's a transdisciplinary answer across the sciences, across all sorts of knowledge systems that humans have gathered in our awareness of who we are on this planet. It's the wellness-informed pathway. What does it look like? This is what we study in our lab. You meet basic needs of humanity, and I'll talk about those in a moment. That's going to foster thriving, just like any species needs to have its basic needs met, and then things operate well throughout life. And for us, it also develops our heart-mindedness, that sense of spiritual connection, that sense of being holistically one with the universe, actually, and feeling good and okay about ourselves. And then also connectedness. It supports our earth-centered living know-how as well. Now, how do we know this wellness pathway exists? Because we can see it all over the world in societies that provide basic needs, especially in childhood, but also throughout adulthood. So let's look at what those are. What are our basic needs? Well, we've got animal needs. We all know these, right? For nourishment, warmth, protection, and safety. Unfortunately, a lot of adults forget that they think that's enough for babies, for example. It isn't. Our neurobiology, the way our brains grow and develop, our social capacities, our moral capacities, are affected by the rest of these needs being met. So that includes affection, play, inclusion in the community and welcomed in the community, needs for extensive bonding, community support, and social enjoyment, and then our specific human needs beyond our mammalian needs. For intersubjectivity with multiple adults, our immersion in communal life, apprenticeship, and having meaningful experiences and narratives and stories that guide us, as well as our ability to expand, to self-transcend, and to heal all the things we do wrong or get out of balance. Now, Mary will talk about this in her presentation, but in our lab, we study the evolved nest. The evolved nest meets basic needs, and it's especially important in early life when the brain is developing itself so quickly, because babies are born, they resemble fetuses of other animals for the first 18 months of life at least, and so they need every need met quickly, while the brain is growing thousands of connections every second. And if you leave a baby in distress to cry, alone, the wrong biochemistry ensues. So there'll be cortisol levels will increase, melting brain connections, or the wrong things will grow. They'll be more self-protective than growing the open-hearted sociality that must grow after birth. And so this is a wellness-informed piece of how we get to our thriving selves. It's every animal has a nest, and we do too, and we just kind of forgot it. In civilization, industrialization especially. Most of these characteristics are over 75 million years old. And these are provided or provisioned by a community, not just mom and dad. It's the community of support for all these pieces that Mary will go through in a while. So what does thriving look like? We also forgot this. And this we can see in the societies around the world that provide for basic needs. Again, it's a set that we need to remind ourselves of. What does optimal human functioning look like? So the thriving individual is going to have a quiet mind, an inner happiness and glee, vitality and being fully alive, autonomous, makes their own decisions, honest, has a good sense of humor, a silly kind of sense of humor, outstanding memory and senses, builds habits at will, has know-how for getting along in the landscape where they live, has an ecological attachment to that landscape, and feels a connection to spirit, the greater oneness. In relationship, these people enjoy being with others, and they enhance other people's well-being. They're relationally attuned and responsive, give empathy, listen unconditionally, are communally oriented. They're authentically helpful and provide unconditional love and forgiveness. They're generous and fiercely egalitarian, and they respect ancestors and future generations. And they feel responsible for the web of life. Now how many people know someone who has these characteristics? Okay, good, I'm so glad. Yay, we're not lost yet, right? Okay, so when our basic needs are met, it really leads to a society where you're spending more of your time in this positive social engagement. You're sharing music, dance, and song. This is what we see around the world. And you're enjoying one another, and you're enhancing one another, and the community is enhanced by your well-being, and it just is this nice flow. And you spend very little time in what we call social self-protectionism, which is about bracing against life and being oppositional or withdrawn because you don't feel safe. So I'll say more about that later. So in our wellness pathway, we have societal thriving then. And you can see that it's a very high communal, but also high autonomy, individualism plus communalism together. And our morality then is based in the capacities that we have grown then from being immersed in situations that grow our practice of relational engagement, of being face-to-face relationally attuned, being able to resonate with the other, intersubjectively mind meld, right? That's what the baby needs from the beginning with mom and dad or community members, caregivers, to have that sense of resonance with love, right? You don't want them to resonate with depression or anger, right? You want them to resonate with love. And that's what this is about. So it's a very small ego-oriented. It's other-oriented instead, and primed by attachment relationships, supportive, caring relationships in the community. And then when our abstract thinking kicks in, our ability to think outside the present moment, it's a communal imagination. And you have a deep sense of egalitarian respect for the other, a resonant responsibility, a sympathetic action. All this then is constructed postnatally. So it really matters what that nest is. And finally, it leads to this kind of wellness pathway to know-how for sustainable earth-centered living, and Aldo Leopold explained it well, to understand that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, and it's wrong when it tends otherwise. So this is the wellness-informed pathway. You meet the basic needs, you promote thriving, develop a heart-minded individual and community, and know-how for a deeply sustainable life. Now, as you know, we're not on that pathway. This is our pathway, and the United States is pretty much leading the way. We don't meet basic needs. We don't have parental leave. We're parent advisors tell parents to let babies cry themselves to sleep, leave them alone, sleep alone. All this then reorients the brain towards self-protectionism. We'll see that in a second. Promotes ill-being then throughout life. Underdevelops the heart, mind, that heart-mindedness, the connection of all of our being to the higher spirit, to God. And we end up with a lack of know-how for how to get along with others, how to live sustainably. Psychologically or physiologically, when basic needs are ignored in early life, we can see now, we can map this out with neuroscientific studies, that early life stress, big deal now. Even the Academy of Pediatrics is concerned about this and has just put out a paper about it, how important it is to provide supportive relationships to babies and young children. Otherwise, these things get misestablished, especially that stress response. We can see that. It's easily triggered, and you feel threatened, and your blood flow shifts. You can't think very well. You're not going to be open-hearted. You have now moved into a self-protectionist mode, and your vision narrows. All sorts of things happen to you in your body that guide then how you think and how you act. Psychologically, then, you're taught to distrust your body. You're taught to distrust others because they didn't respond to your needs, right? And you learn the world is unsafe. And then you're easily conscripted into conspiracy theories, to all sorts of paranoia, to all sorts of things about out there is scary and terrible, and I better arm myself against those disagreeable things out there. So you live against others instead of with others. Specifically, we look at social opposition. That's when your fight system is very highly activated routinely in baby life, and you learn that that works to get your way. You make a big tantrum, fit, and then people finally give you what you need or what you think you need at the time. Or you've learned that didn't work. You had to shut down just to survive, and so you go into the fight-freeze mode and withdraw, and these things happen automatically. You're conditioned in babyhood towards these things, and you lose your free will as an adult because you've been conditioned to be self-bracing, and then you can be emotionally dissociated. So that happens. We encourage that in school. Don't feel your feelings. Don't think about your intuitions. Don't look out the window and think about the bird, right? We want them to be in their intellect, right? That left brain dominated thinking that you were talking about, Jeffrey. That's all about, oh, I'm going to categorize everything, et cetera. I better keep going here. Brain function, then, what happens with good early development is your executive functions, your higher order thinking, controls those things you're born with, the survival systems, and you spend your life in this sociality of enjoyment and safety, a sense of primarily safety with others. But when things go wrong in early life, toxic stress is going to lead to a self-protectionist disposition where your stress response kicks in, shuts down your higher thinking, that's what it does physiologically, and your mammalian sociality just doesn't grow properly. So you can spend your life on the right side of this diagram where in pretty much a lot of times, and you don't even know it because it's so subliminal, you feel unsafe. And you have to go into a dominant orientation or a submissive orientation. And that can happen from the bottom up, from your neurobiology, or top down from the stories that you're told. Green people are dangerous. Oh, unsafe, I see a green person. And you go into the mode of oppositionalism or withdrawal. Whereas, of course, we want to be on the left side, which is open to life. So trauma-informed practices understand the right side. Wellness-informed understands that we need the left side to be our primary focus, optimization. Otherwise, our everyday life is really going to look like this. We spend most of our time in self-protection ethics, and our imagination is linked to viciousness or control of others, and we have very little time and engagement of that open-hearted way of being with one another, and we lose our heart. Our heart is locked down because it's not safe to be out there. You learn that from early on. And then this leads to different worldviews. So we study, too, the indigenous perspective, which has been around for 99% still. Hundreds of groups around the world hold this view. And we're seeing that if we don't get back to the indigenous perspective, we're going to destroy the planet. Okay, so the dominant, the one that we're familiar with is the one on the left side, this purple, fragmented, disenchanted, amoral cosmos. You know, it doesn't matter, nature's dead, inert, you know, and humans are the pinnacle of evolution or creation, whatever you want to say. And so and this, I think, comes from the bottom-up experiences. You latch onto this narrative because it makes sense, because that's what you experienced. You experienced a very amoral cosmos. It was very uncaring, unsupportive in early life. And then you have a big hole in your heart, and so you want to hoard things. You're trying to fill that hole that you never should have had, instead of being on the right side, which is the indigenous perspective. This is our baseline. Virtually every society in the world has had this position. The Western world switched us over but of course it kind of drifted in for a few millennia. And on this side of the diagram here, the worldview is that the world is unified, sacred, and moral. That spirit pervades all things. It's panpsychism and animism, which is the negative term Westerners have used, mutual relatedness with everything. That we're really the younger siblings of everything else. We have much to learn from the trees, the oak trees, the mosses. Everything is older than us. And we just sort of showed up now, and we need to learn how to be placeful, at home on the earth, to fit in with the local landscape, and to share in our maternal gift economy. Nature's gift economy is the way that we evolved, the way nature evolved, giving, taking, over and over and over. So how do we get back to wellness? This is what we study in the lab as we look at early experience, how it leads to a certain kind of individual psychosocial neurobiology, a certain kind of adult being, and a culture that builds on those adults' capacities. And for us, right now, we've got extreme social poverty going on. So we have undercare of young children, developmental inappropriate, leading to dysregulations of all kinds. We're measuring some of it, vagus nerve and such, but there's many things. And then adults are kind of sickly, and they don't get along well, and they don't know how to get along cooperatively except to dominate someone else or withdraw. And then they promote a trauma-inducing culture that we have, because adults are distracted by their own needs. They're overwhelmed, they're neglectful, or over-controlling. They're all cacostatic. They're not homeostatic in their functioning. But this is our heritage. Our heritage is companionship care from conception that leads to a healthy psychosocial neurobiology, adults who are well and wise, and communities who attend to basic needs. So our stories that we tell here matter. I just told you a different story than the one you typically hear. It matters because it affects how you think about what you should do, right? So we need to attend then to our basic needs, to shift back to a sacred life and living earth story. That's God's creation. It was created all alive, right? And we know that science is telling us forests are alive, rivers are alive. Fish feel pain. On and on and on. Science is helping us see how we can return to that perspective. A bunch of books. I have some here if you want to look at them. The new one coming out is Restoring the Kinship Worldview with 4 arrows. And some of these are from symposia we've had at Notre Dame. And the book that won the Expanded Reason Award is The Neurobiology and Development of Human Morality. It also won the William James Book Award from the American Psychological Association. So good endorsements from a broad perspective. It's interdisciplinary. So here is more information. Lots of stuff at the blog I have, webpage, academic papers. And I especially encourage you to watch the Breaking the Cycle film that we have, 6 minutes long. Gives you the big picture of the 2 cycles. And here's a QR code for it. And then Evolve Nest has a lot of material, as I said. Thank you very much. Just going to get everything.
Thank you, Tarsha. Our next speaker is Mary Tarsha.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Mary Tarsha. And before I begin, I would just like to thank Jeffrey and Tarsha for their great presentations. And to clarify that, it is very important the way in which we do conduct science. And I'm going to present a lot of information from our own lab and some converging data from other sources. But just like to clarify that the social imagination does matter, and the way in which we conduct research is always with a focus on how we can respect the dignity of the human person, the type of research questions we ask, the way in which we collect data, how we analyze data. So that is always in the forefront of our minds, and even who we cite, where we publish, how we promote that. So from the beginning. So the title of my talk is Humanity's Evolved Nest, the Neurobiological Building Blocks of socio-moral development. So to begin with, in early life, the human is very immature neurobiologically. Within the first year of life, the brain doubles, and at the third year of life, 80% of the child's brain has been developed. And so the way in which the brain develops is dependent upon a continual interaction between both nature and nurture. So this involves both the genes and the neurobiological processes within the human person, but also the type of caregiving experience that the infant receives. And that type of experience has the potential to turn genes on or off, which is the field of study known as epigenetics. And so in this way, caregivers are very important in co-constructing the human person because emotions and cognitions are developing together. They're not separate. And this is laying the foundation for the implicit self, both social and moral, as well as the social worldview. So in order to develop well, human infants need an experience that's similar to a womb with a view, soothing and comforting, also known as exterogestation. So this leads to the question, if caregivers are so important, what exactly are they co-constructing? They're constructing the body, the brain, and the psyche, and this is laying the foundation for all future capacities, including socio-moral capacities such as compassion, empathy, and cooperative sociality. So now, as Tarsha spoke a little bit about the evolved nest, the evolved nest is that type of caregiving environment that optimizes neurobiological development, all physical development, psychological development, and socio-moral capacities. So again, it is provisioned by a community. We're not blaming moms or dads, but it takes many people in order to provide this. And as Tarsha mentioned, most of these components are ancient, 30 to 40 million years old. So what is the evolved nest? So I'd like to draw your attention to the left-hand side, right here. So these are a list of the components that we have identified that are critical to help support children in all these capacities. And then on the right-hand side is a description of what we actually mean by that. So I'll explain. So the first one are soothing pre- and perinatal experiences. So this means no stressful experiences before conception, which there's mounting evidence now that stress in the mother or father, life history of stress, is very important in predicting child outcomes. No stress during pregnancy or limited stress. Once born, no separation with mother and baby, and then no painful procedures when the infant once born. The second one is breastfeeding. And in our ancestral context, this is on request for several years. I know that can be a shocker to hear for several years. The third one is positive moving touch with no negative touch. And so this is almost continual positive touch, no corporal punishment. Number 4 is positive climate. So this is a welcoming community of support for both the baby, the mother, the father, the family at large. Number 5 is self-directed social play. So this is free play with other children and ideally within a natural environment. Multiple allo mothers. So allo mothers are caregivers other than the mother, like father and grandparents and aunts and uncles, that are there to help provide responsive care. And what we mean by responsive care is meeting the needs of the infant or child in the moment. So we're not negating the need or we're not undermining the need in any way. And then number 8 is nature connection, as Tarsha was talking about, having a sense of an attachment to the natural world. And then, of course, routine healing practices, because life events do happen that cause disruption or distress within relationships and communities. So these need to be embedded within, routinely within the child's experience. So just like to say that as I said before, the way we conduct research is trying to respect the dignity of the human person, but also each component of the nest, because it is about satisfying the basic needs of the child, is really about upholding the dignity of the human person, the family, and the community. Or said another way, when we deprive children of one of those components, we're really cutting against their own dignity. So now I'm going to go through each of the components, and there are decades of research on each one of these components, but for the sake of time, I'm going to just show you a little bit about the key takeaways of why each one of these is important. And this is converging evidence from many different fields of study. So soothing perinatal and prenatal experiences. So unfortunately, many common practices here within our own beloved country cut against this. So this means they interfere with the timing of the baby and really stress the mother and the infant. Labor drugs can also be very, very harmful. Routine medical practices such as smells and bright lights, rough treatment of the infant, extensive separation of the mother and the baby, vaccination and circumcision. And all of this can affect the mother-infant entrainment, both physiologically and psychologically. Number 2 is breastfeeding. So, we know from comparative studies comparing breastfed infants to formula-fed infants that breastfed infants show a higher intelligence and higher executive functioning skills. And this difference seems to persist even into adulthood. Breast milk is phenomenal for multiple reasons, one of which is that it's an analgesic. So it not only reduces pain, like psychologically comforting the child, but it actually reduces the experience of pain itself physically. The sugars alone, so there's the sugar and the fat component. So the oligosaccharides within breast milk have this is brand new, just discovered at Vanderbilt, have an antimicrobial, antiprotective biofilm component. So it's helping build the infant's immune system. And breastfed infants generally have larger brains and greater myelinization of white matter. And when we look at observational studies, breastfed babies tend to have greater cognitive and behavioral development. Okay, for 3, this is positive moving touch with no negative touch. So for mammals, separating a mother or a baby from its mother can have a lot of dysregulatory effects, causing lifelong changes in the stress responsivity. So what we mean by that is the way in which that child will grow up and handle future stressful experiences will be very different. And so this can have lifelong consequences in terms of violent behavior, antisocial behavior, as well as depressive disorders. So mammals need touch to grow and synthesize DNA, and this helps build healthy sleep cycles, adaptive behavioral arousals, exploratory activities, and social and cognitive functioning. So all of that is about the positive side of positive affectionate touch. But on the other side, there's negative touch, which is harsh touch, corporal punishment. And so we now have 3 decades of evidence showing that physical abuse and corporal punishment are very harmful. So a recent meta-analysis down here, concluded that spanking is empirically similar to physical and emotional abuse when we're looking at the negative outcomes of internalizing disorders and externalizing disorders in children. Number 4 is positive social climate. So this includes an environment that is more positive than negative, having emotional experiences of joy, serenity, and expansiveness. And positive emotions in childhood are predictive of adults who are more secure, mentally healthier, and less distressed. So this is an experience where the child feels loved and cherished and welcomed, and this helps them create relationships and deep friendships. Number 5 is self-directed social play. So just like to clarify this, we don't mean organized sports, although those have good, soccer's great, and other ways, okay, but we're talking about self-directed. So this is play that kids are engaging on their own. It's not organized by adults, and ideally within the natural world. And so this type of play facilitates emotion regulation development, and this also including aggressive urges, right? And this influences gene expression profiles and helps foster brain development in general. So there's really good news about social play and that it helps develop the right hemisphere. So in early life, the brain is not developing symmetrically. The right brain is developing more quickly than the left. And the right brain is important for things like self-regulation, intersubjectivity and social pleasure, emotional intelligence, empathy, beingness, self-transcendence, and a higher consciousness. So the good news here is that even in adulthood, if there has been a deficit, social free play can help regrow that. Allo mothers, so these are other caregivers other than mother that help provide responsive care to the developing child. And so mothers themselves need a lot of social support to care well for their children. And we know that mothers who have a sense of perceived social support, that this correlates positively with their children's social skills and then negatively with behavior problems. So this is an important quote, that children do best in societies where child rearing is considered too important to be left entirely to parents. Probably the most robust predictor and well-studied within the literature are responsive relationships. And again, this is meeting the infant's and child's needs in the moment. And this helps develop a reciprocal communication between the caregiver and the child. And so there establishes a synchrony and also opportunities to repair dyssynchrony. And this helps build shared narratives between the child and the caregiver. And this type of interaction helps brain wiring, emotion regulation, and really sets a trajectory for habitual patterns later in life. So one example of the importance of responsive care on developing the neurobiology of the human person is the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve, which innervates all organs within the human body, the heart, the lungs, digestive tract, immune system, and is operative in all social behavior. There is a lot of variability individual variability within our vagus nerve functioning as adults. And we know that this is dependent upon the type of social relationships, responsive relationships we have in early life. So in order to have an adaptive, well-functioning vagus nerve as an adult, it requires, especially within the first 6 years of life, a set of responsive caregiving environments. And as an adult, this is toning up, right, that vagus nerve in order to be well developed. And then this helps calm, soothe, and restore processes both physiologically and psychologically. So with a well-functioning vagus nerve, then we can engage socially with others. We have the ability to rest, digest, heal, and grow. Number 8 is nature connection. I know I'm going really fast, but there's a lot of good information here, and I don't want to leave anything out. And so this includes activities such as walking outside, sunning, and earthing. And Tarsha and her colleagues just did a recent intervention for just 3 weeks with a list of some of these activities right here. And that was enough to increase ecological attachment or a sense of attachment to the natural world. And then lastly, healing practices. And these are things like singing and meditation, prayer, talking with friends, helping others, all of these that help restore imbalances both psychologically and physically. So just to repeat, each of these, because of the wealth of knowledge we have and evidence behind them, we see that each one of these components is really critical for upholding the dignity of the developing person. And so now I'm just going to go through some empirical data from our lab in which we were testing the effects of the evolved nest, and we're working out the mechanisms by which the evolved nest and different components are affecting both child and adult outcomes. So right here, we asked the question, at 12 months of age, what of the evolved nest is most important for predicting inhibitory self-control 3 years later? And we found that breastfeeding, playing with the mom, and alloparents were the most predictive or the strongest predictors of inhibitory self-control, which is a very critical component of sociomoral behavior. This is another study with women. These were all mothers. And we investigated how much of the evolved nest they received in their childhood, as well as how much trauma they experienced. And what we found was that their trauma significantly influenced their vagal functioning, but that the evolved nest buffered that, so that these women, the more of the nest that they had in their childhood, the more adaptive they were, both during a resting condition as well as during a challenging task. And this is a summary of studies that we've done examining what actually influences child vagal tone at 6 years of age. And we found the blue indicates supports and the red is what is hindering that. And so we found, again, free play is particularly important, as we're talking about in terms of vagal tone, the amount of touch, also how self-protective the mother is. So this is what Tarsha was talking about, the more bracing behavior the mother is, this is stressing the child out and influencing their vagus tone. And then also the mother's own stress, both physiologically and her perceived stress, is also important. So just to summarize, I presented a lot of information, but we see that across fields there is converging evidence for the importance of the evolved nest. And this is laying the groundwork for the neurobiology of the human person, which then gives rise to both physical and psychological well-being, which then helps us understand sociomoral capacities. So to put all of this together, we see companionship care as another way of understanding the evolved nest. And so that's really what it's about. Companionship caregiving gives rise to good physical, neuro, and social biology, which then leads to adults who are well, healthy, and wise, and are able to contribute to the larger community. Okay, and here's some more information here and some QR codes if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those really beautiful presentations. I invite our panelists up. We have time for a few questions, and since the heart, mind, and spirit are more important than food, I'll spill over a little beyond the hour. So please go to the mic. Is there a mic in the middle? Yeah. It's being recorded, so please go to the mic to ask your questions. And while we're sitting down, I'd like to ask Mary, you mentioned that perinatal pain is something to be avoided. How do you respond to the cultural tradition of circumcision?
I'll take this one. I've written about this.
Okay.
Yeah, circumcision is a traumatic experience for a baby, even though they might say we've given them some analgesic.
A little louder.
Even though they might have, doctors may have said they're giving some pain block or something. The research shows psychologically there's long-term issues. A lot of men are distressed, and then there are physiological issues that come up later, but I don't know. We don't need to go into the details. I think but there's quite a bit. There's a good movie to watch, American Circumcision. Goes through both sides of it and gives you the information, some basic stuff.
Okay. Questions from the audience?
I wanted to start by thanking you all for.
Maybe turn the mic on.
Should be on now. All right. I just wanted to thank you all for everything you said. It was very useful. This is for Dr. Tarsha. I was wondering, so you were talking about the evolved nest, and I think that our society might view this, I mean, in how I've been raised and how I've been told about raising children, like how does this not result in a spoiled brat if you're meeting every, if you're meeting every single need of the child as they desire?
Yeah, I actually get that question very often. So responsivity is providing what the child needs, and sometimes the child might need to figure it out on their own, right? But you need a developmental perspective. So letting an infant figure it out on his own is not meeting the child's needs, right? Letting a child cry it out is not meeting the child's needs. But older, maybe they need to play with the toy and figure it out. So yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I've written about this too. Spoiling a child is kind of a myth because once you start to neglect their needs, they're getting dysregulated, and they're going to be much more difficult to take care of later because you've dysregulated them, and you don't know exactly what, because every baby's developing at their own rate, and different things are growing at different times. And so you don't want a baby that's going to be stress reactive and start to scream to get their needs met when they're 4, 5, 10, 12, 15, right? So you want to meet those basic needs because they're like, they need that womb, that external womb. So you think about the baby as just a little fetus for 2 years.
Yeah, and often, and meeting the need also doesn't mean intellectualizing with a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, right? So if they're having emotional reaction, you don't try to think through it with them. So that would be an unresponsive approach. So when we use that term, it's important to clarify. Thank you.
Thank you.
Big thing is to keep the baby calm.
Like following the path, the
Speak
question
into
that he
the
was
mic, please.
asking. I've been working with kids for 10 years, and I have been working as a nanny, so I know a lot of babies and different kind of different families. So the question is, like you were saying, responding every single need, like but how you regulate, because when you respond every single need, they also get stimulated in that way, and they just learn to us in that way. So when they are babies, I'm not saying go to the extreme of let them like just cry a lot and those things, but how to teach them? You say that because sometimes responding to every single need just make them more like wanted to do it in that way, or especially when you have a 2-year-old. And I have been dealing with kids for a long time. I knew different kind of kids. So.
Yeah, so it has to do, when we talk about meeting the child's needs, it is a responsivity that you're syncing biologically with them, so you're able to respond. So a child who has an experience over and over and over of having their needs met, they will be regulated. So infants and children cannot regulate themselves. That needs to be clarified, right? So that's part of the myth, is that the infant will just soothe him or herself, that the child needs external caregivers in order to regulate himself. And that's really clear in the literature. Do you want to add?
Responding to a baby means you follow their face and their gestures. They're starting to get uncomfortable. You don't want that biochemistry going, and so you have to calm them then, not wait for them to cry. That's a late signal. So they're already practicing being distressed if you wait that long. And so you're shaping their personality. This is complicated stuff. It changes with development. By age 2, you got to be careful about the little neuro tantrums, and distinguish those from distress tantrums. And there's a lot of stuff to know. There's a good book called There's No Such Thing as Naughty. It's a new book out that's very helpful for parents and has a lot of examples of how to be responsive.
This is a question for Dr. Bishop, but for all the panelists. I'm interested in how you talked about popular science and our popular understanding. I'm interested in how that percolates down into society and affects the people whom you are studying. I recently went through an experience with one of my children who had an EEG, and I was asked to report behaviors, and then they were confirmed by the results of the EEG. And afterwards I thought, I wonder if I should have waited to hear what the EEG was going to say before, like having a lot of the vocabulary already as a person going into that. I was curious how our knowledge of these things affects your ability to study people who know what you're trying to see, if that makes sense.
Well, I'm not sure I'll answer this rightly what you mean, but I'll riff off of some things that you've said. How about that? So look, we always understand the world in terms of things that we're pretty sure we think we know, right? And so every scientist is going to bring to bear import various assumptions that are dancing in the background, that are not even at the foreground, okay? And so that's going to be true for you who are trying to report things to somebody who's measuring using a scientific device. And we have to remember that when you're doing an EEG, you're not actually asking a scientific question, you're actually asking a clinical question. And so that's a slightly different process, okay? Clinical stuff, you try to get the right question, but it emerges from the scientific stuff, but it's really not a scientific question. It's still a clinical question. It's very directed, okay? So it's probably a slightly different thing. I'll pose this as a question to my colleagues because I also think it's an important dimension, is that we're always, I'll be a little critical, so forgive me. If you look at some of the descriptions that you had, like homeostasis and self-regulation and egalitarianism and all of that, those are things that there's evidence for, absolutely. But there's also evidence for things like grit, which is, how do I behave when I face an opposition? In the virtue tradition, part of vice is something that you don't have to work at. It just happens in complacency. So opposition is actually the kind of thing that makes virtue possible, right? It's the overcoming of negative things that happen in you. We always say about virtue or wisdom, it's the thing you get just after you need it, right? So you're sitting there and you're trying to sort through it, right? So it is part of the learning process to overcome the oppositional thing. So imagine if we had thought of, if we started valorizing certain other characteristics like, willfulness, self-responsibility, personal responsibility. We could probably find the neurological transmitters for those other positive characteristics that don't fit in some of the descriptions that you've given, right? So the social, I love what you have to say, and I agree completely that we need a completely different way of imagining development in this country. Part of our critique is that the neopolitical order is creating the exact stressors that you're describing. Completely agree, okay? So I'm in 100% agreement. But when we construct an alternative world, right, we're also bringing other assumptions to bear in that might forget some of the things like personal responsibility or grit or working against an opposition, because the opposition itself is taken up into the neurobiology as you're overcoming it, right? And it begins to shape this thing that now psychologists are calling grit, which then they have an operational definition for it, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an ongoing process, and it's going to be difficult for us to have a full psychological or neurobiological or neuroscientific account for it. And there's one other thing that we fail to take into consideration. What was it? C.S. Lewis said the single most or maybe it was Tolkien, I forget, one of the two of the smart guys said something to the effect of, the only doctrine that we have empirical evidence for from Christianity is sin. And so there is a dimension of that self-directedness that becomes problematic that we reinforce with our culture, et cetera. But we have to take that dark side in as well. We live in a world that is harmonious at some level, but it is always novelty, new things pop up, new threats arise, and that has to be taken into consideration as well.
We'll take one more question.
So I very much appreciate the talk, especially it seems to elevate breastfeeding and the closeness of the mother and the child early on in development and the importance of that, which I think is beautiful. I have one particular aspect of the evolved nest, which left me with a little bit of a question. I'm thinking of Cardinal Sarah's book, and he talks about being raised in his early childhood in probably had many of the elements of the evolved nest in an African village with many of the social ties that were tight. But he described terror through learning an animist. Now I know that's a negative term, but even like what we could call a panpsychism. Because the elements of the world were alive for him, and that didn't only include harmony with the rivers and the trees, but also thunderstorms, snake bites, alligators. And he was extremely freed when he learned the Christian understanding of a theocentric world where man is not the top, God is, but it's not all the same soul shared amongst all, and that rivers and trees could also provide a terrifying reality for him, and that he was freed when he experienced a Christian creationist view. So I just wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, we kind of went fast there. But yeah, I think the sense of oneness is one thing, that oceanic feeling. But to have a sense that there's a greater power than you or than human beings, and that human beings, again, are not the pinnacle, right? And they're not the only ones responsible, that you have to be in touch with spirit, with God, and I think the Christian message is really good at helping us realize that, right? So. Can I just say one thing? One thing I didn't, this is not different. One thing I didn't mention is a lot of the neuroscience that's done today, the fMRIs and such, are done on brains that were not raised in the evolved nest. And so they're really not species typical. We're studying species abnormal brains, and then we're drawing conclusions and generalizations from that. So we have to be very cautious about it. We are much greater than we can see. The sciences really gives us the minimum kind of look at who we are as human beings. God created us to be beautiful and thriving, and we've kind of lost our way in getting there, and so we have to remember it.
Yeah, go ahead. I'd just like to invite each of you to say some final concluding thoughts.
This is the thing about science. Science is by definition analytic. It cuts things up. It looks at it in a fragmented way that we then try, because we can't know the whole of our own being. We can't imagine the whole of our own being, and so we use very narrow models to kind of give us an anchor to say what is true about us. And then we take that and we blow that up as if it is the only truth about us, right? So the model is, even John Stuart Mill, who first articulated the positive science of economics, but also positive science of psychology. He was first philosopher of positivism, okay? He was a brilliant scientific thinker. And even he knew, when he got criticized for his little essay on political economy and the scientific study of political economy, he backtracked immediately. That's when somebody said, "Oh, you're talking about Homo economicus. You've reduced it to that." And he says, "Yeah, that's what science does. It necessarily reduces." So a lot of the things that you guys have described scientifically are little reductions that are absolutely necessary to be able to say what we think is true, bounded by the experimental limits, okay? but it's only true within the boundaries of the experimental limits. Then we creatively try to leap out from that and put together other pieces to try to articulate a larger anthropology. But most all scientific anthropologies are kind of reductive to the measurable, okay? And what do we can measure? Numbers, oh, money. That becomes community in a lot of these studies, okay? Now, you guys are doing a richer exploration of that. I get that. I completely agree with you on that. But it's still, at the same time, it's still a reductive model that we then have to do something else with.
Let me just say also that the science that we're talking about here is Western science, because indigenous science is holistic, it's observational, it's thousands of years old. And I didn't mention that traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, is what indigenous peoples around the world have for their local landscapes. It's place-based scientific knowledge we really need to return to, because every landscape needs a different way of being nurtured. And so that's the other piece. We can all adopt an indigenous worldview, which I mentioned, but to get that indigenous knowledge, we have to be there and we have to learn it from our elders. In those places, 80% of the biodiversity that still exists is in the 20% of lands that indigenous peoples oversee. This is a UN report on that. So let's go with the indigenous science. I think our Western stuff is kind of leading us astray. Thank you.
I think it just points to the importance of theory, what theory is driving your research, and then how you interpret your results. And so the evolved nest is really pointing to these universal basic needs, these Catholic needs that we all have. And by providing that, it's supporting the dignity of the human person.
So this is a really important subject. And I was talking with somebody the other day, and we were saying how so many people in our society seem a little out of balance. And he was saying you can even see it in the way people drive. And it struck me that the nest concept here goes beyond child rearing. It goes all the way up into the full community. And I think our identities and our stability as human individuals is based on this great syncytium of social interactions. So we need to take the statements of the gospel very seriously and the mysteries of the gospel very seriously, because I think in the final end, the nest is really the body of Christ.
Beautiful.
Okay, so thank you very much for our very thoughtful presentation.